When Robert and I were teenagers in the 90s, we both had a number of classmates who moved from the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina to Sweden with their families. Their descriptions of the huge bazaar and narrow oriental lanes in the old town in the peaceful time have kept our imagination spinning in many years. It's about 9 o'clock in a Sunday morning and the market is already on its very full run. People are very busy to select the very fresh produced vegetables from this region. The color of the vegetable and the fruits are so fantastic, it could mesmerize everybody's mind. For us, the stereotypical scene from the Bosnian everyday lives involves, among others, drinking the strong Bosnian coffee from a tiny little bronze goblet and tasting the newly baked borek with cold yogurt sauce on top, whilst contemplating the meaning of life in the worrisome time, or the importance of being a perfect role model for a bunch of young kids who have seen too much violence in their early years. The scent of various ripe fruit and veggies encourage us to reevaluate the idea of the quality of life. This is the legendary Sunday's market. Just look at the animals in such beautiful autumn colors. It's a wonderful surprise. We didn't expect to see this. And the thing is, it's so exciting to see that people still hold to this tradition which has lasted many years. It gives me as a tourist such a great joy. The Oriental culture influence is still an important feature in the everyday lives here in Sarajevo, ranging from the interior decoration concepts, scholarly teaching upon the academic level, religious practice, folk music and dance, culinary traditions and leisure games. The pious Muslim families celebrate all the traditional holidays fervently, most of which encourage their followers to pay a close attention to their friends and acquaintances who might need some extra aid when going through a difficult period. Also the virtue of being a good listener, providing a serene, tranquil solace for anyone who is mournful. During the heydays of the Ottoman Empire, Sarajevo was famous for the splendid mosques, huge public bathhouses, and many important schools for Sufi philosophy. Many of their public facilities were far more superior than their neighboring countries, attracting many ambitious merchants from near and far to trade with each other. Behind me is the famous Beg Mosque, which was erected in the middle of the 16th century in the heyday of Gazi Khusrev's reign in Sarajevo. He was a son of an Ottoman princess and a Bosnian aristocrat who were living in Greece for a long time, and he contributed to the tremendous urbanization process in the middle of the 16th century here in Sarajevo. And just a few meters away from me is the famous Gazi Khusrev Library, which contains probably the biggest collection of the Orient books in the whole entire world. It's really amazing to just let your fantasy fly away back to a period when the whole world is still in some kind of admiration towards Sarajevo, which was the military culture, education, religious center on the crossroad between the East and the West. When I was young, the exciting narratives from the Arabian Nights have encouraged me to daydream. Although I never understood the intended passion and infatuations that ventures upon an exotic region in which nightingales would sing from morning to night in a tropical island, was my incentive to read the travel narratives from the colonization's age. This building complex really take my fantasy with wings. It really looks like a beautiful scene from the famous Disney animation of Aladdin, where the Princess Jasmine sitting in such a colorful, flamboyant room to think, to imagine about a life together with her beloved Aladdin. This masterpiece of architecture really shows the grandeur of the heyday of Sarajevo during the Ottoman Empire reign, and people were so creative and inventive. They could really just transform such a small area on the back of the house to a paradise where you imagine Eve and Adam once lived. I mean, just look at the grapes and look at the roses.
These Sunni Muslims who moved to Bosnia introduced a new set of fascinating cultural traditions in terms of architecture, interior designs, visual art, textile traditions, and many more. The religious conversion itself did not go through without any compromise. As more and more Sephardic Jews migrated to the Balkan regions after the Spanish Inquisition, a new socio-economic structure established as more and more Balkan Catholics became Muslims, thereafter the political elite locally. This chunk of history influenced the political turmoils of Bosnia and Herzegovina in the next 400 years.
This is the study chamber, and its decoration, its interior decoration is rather humble. The only thing you have is this little thing that the person is going to put the book on, up on this small thing. I mean, the study chamber has a very important position in the house because by studying you can gain your knowledge and it will help you to really apply for some important position in the society. And Bosnia and Herzegovina was an important part of the Ottoman Empire, and it is the center of the culture and the education. And personally, I would like to sit inside such a nice chamber just to read, for instance, the history of Roman Empire.
The Muslim scholars established a network of the educational institutions with varying levels of Islamic education in the 16th century, in hope to improve Bosnia's integration into the Imperial Ottoman education network. The establishment of an educated elite amongst the Islamic population encouraged the locals to settle up a new educational infrastructure, which promoted both the religious study as well as science and professional trainings. The emergence of an educational system changed the public atmosphere in a highly stratified society and altered the life trajectories of countless Bosnians.
Prince Franz Ferdinand, the heir of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his young wife was assassinated in this very spot, 1914, almost 100 years ago. And because of this assassination, the structure of Europe changed, and very soon the First World War took its place.
The general perception of being a Bosniak underwent a pejorative transition through the precipitations of the nationalistic ideas introduced by the Austrian scholars as the Balkans crumbled to pieces during the First World War. The idea of piety and the need to seek some kind of consolation and commonalities independent of the ruling world power had somehow encouraged many rebellion young people to seek different political ideas, which sounded nicely theoretically, despite very few scrutinized its details in terms of its technocratic structure in relation with a complex domestic, religious and financial framework.
This is one of the famous playgrounds in Sarajevo, and children are playing with all these combating vehicles which were left behind from the war during the 90s. The thing is, nobody really wants to talk about the war, but sooner or later, the whole city is about what really happened in the middle of the 90s.
At the age of 17, I became friends with an ambitious, taciturn young girl who moved away from Sarajevo with her family to Malmö in Sweden. When talking with her in the schoolyard, the real horror of the Balkan War was rarely mentioned, despite she often described how life was before the sound of explosion broke the peaceful atmosphere in her Turkish quarter daily after Sarajevo had been besieged. I could still see the painful sentiment on her face when seeing the negative news headlines from her old homeland whenever we walked by a newspaper vendor.
The Bosnians formed their own army in 1992. They were almost empty-handed when they started. And what really helped them to fight against the full-armed Serbians is really just three things: patriotism, courage, and readiness to fight for what they believe is the only solution for their misery. And for me, it's impossible to not think about the freedom movement in Tibet, where people were also oppressed by the Chinese communist governments, and there's so much agony and misery in that area. Any day in the near future, there will also break out a civil war in that territory. What would happen? How many people will die? And what will the future scholar evaluate that battle in the future just by looking at small children's blood and old ladies' lament in this photo collection from the 90s in Sarajevo? My heart is broken already.
The matters of the winning sides have often been glorified by the state-sanctioned propaganda campaigns in the past, especially in a totalitarian society, again and again, whilst the perished soldiers or civilians from the other side could be harshly condemned as if they deserved their fatal end. The question is why the ordinary people, like you and I, often have such a huge urge to categorize the nature of the war from a very narrow point of view, again and again, whilst we all have been a piece of insignificant chess piece by the power-hungry warriors. How to act rationally amidst an ongoing armed conflict? Is it ever possible to learn to think from a very different perspective, which sounds counterintuitive from the very beginning?
Here is a familiar name, Lars-Erik Wingren, and his name is encrypted here on the stone in Sarajevo. I hope he had done something nice for this country. It feels so proud to be here to say that this city really commemorates the Swedish contribution to the Balkan conflicts back in the 90s.
Time passed by fast. We are no longer a couple of teenagers who hope that the world would transfer itself to the Garden of Eden again, with the help of the most noble political ideologies. Jeff Kennedy once asked the American citizens to ask themselves what they could do to their country, rather than what their country could do for them. When walking around in Sarajevo, I would like to ask myself if the idea of nations, the most prominent political hegemony, need to be re-evaluated again. Have we seen all the negative consequences of the basic idea of patriotism yet?